Reinhardt is undoubtedly the most iconic tank in Overwatch, and I'd argue he's near the top throughout all of gaming. He has that big bulky armor paired with his legendary hammer and shield, yet design alone is not what grants him this honor. It sure helps, but Ryan also has his fair share of history, all of which builds up to him claiming this title, whilst simultaneously becoming loved by the majority of players. So how did Reinhardt become the iconic Overwatch tank?
Bring it on! I live for this!
Well, let's go back to 2016 for Overwatch 1's official release. Reinhardt was one of the game's original 21 heroes, and one of only 5 tanks at the time. That fact could cause some issues in the future, but from the start he was immediately well liked by the new player base. His simple yet rewarding kit made him fun to play thanks to his immense pressure and big hammer, without feeling bad to go again since he could only do damage up close. And he was well liked by his teammates thanks to the shield keeping them safe. As a result, he became the most played tank in the game's beta prior to its launch, and I suspect that this continued to be the case afterwards. This was a great start for the German Crusader, but would he be able to keep it up? I know this is about Ryan's history, but when talking about why he is so iconic, I can't completely ignore his design. Reinhardt is the embodiment of a classic video game tank, with his big, bulky armor, huge shield, and heavy yet devastating melee weapon. He's simple to pick up due to not needing good aim, while still feeling rewarding to master on the side of mental warfare and game sense. He has a lively personality and just looks epic, alongside having a solid, albeit at this time undeveloped, backstory. These elements obviously combine to make him both very appealing to new players, especially those coming from non-shooter backgrounds, as well as being the natural pick for most iconic Overwatch tank in 2016. However, to truly become an icon, Ryan still had to earn that spot, so how did he? As I said, Ryan was already the most popular tank at the game's launch, and this continued to be the case. Casuals were loving him, and as soon as Hero Lock got introduced, aka teams couldn't spam multiple of the same hero, then he even became prevalent at the top of the ladder. In top 500, he constantly acted as the main tank, commonly being paired with Hog, D.Va or Zarya, and he would stay there for the rest of 2016. In the first Overwatch World Cup that year, he and Zarya would almost always be picked, and in both seasons 1 and 2 of Apex, he stayed at the top. However, this doesn't necessarily mean he was unbalanced or unfair. Sure, he may have been annoyingly necessary at times, but that was simply because he was the only true tank. D.Va, Hog and Zarya were all more damage oriented, so-called off tanks, and Winston was clearly very different from Ryan. This meant that whenever pretty much anyone except Tracer or Genji was meta, you needed a Ryan to hold the front line, because he was the only one that could properly do it. As such, he actually didn't receive a single balance change for the first year of the game, despite being meta almost that entire time. However, people were still beginning to get somewhat frustrated with Ryan simply because he had been meta for so long. So after first releasing a support and DPS, a new tank was finally added to the game, and it was a main tank. Just like Ryan, Orisa had a shield to protect her teammates and could thereby provide a sense of competition to Reinhardt's role. Sure, she had a relatively weak launch and was still different from Ryan due to her ranged, more static playstyle, yet she did affect him nonetheless. From the start, her impact wasn't huge and Ryan was still favoured, but over time Orisa would come to divert plays. Slowly, cracks were beginning to fall. Combine this with how frustratingly buggy Ryan could be at times, and you'd begin to wonder if he'd be able to weather this storm and stay on top. And things would only get worse. That's because this was around the time that Dive finally came into the limelight. At the game's launch, Ryan was the only standard main tank, but there was another. Winston, together with Tracer and Genji, made up the core of a small sub-archetype in Overwatch, involving extreme amounts of mobility to rapidly engage onto isolated targets. Up to this point, Dive hadn't usually been worth running, but thanks to some balance changes in early 2017, it finally became the meta. And this marked the first time post-Hero Lock that Ryan hadn't been the go-to at all levels of play. He had finally been dethroned. And this wasn't just temporary, rather it would continue to be the case for a full year. So, Ryan had gained new competition, he was pushed out of the meta, and he was a buggy mess. Wait, allow me to touch on that last part. Up to this point, Ryan had been one of the most infuriatingly buggy heroes in the game. He had times where his swings wouldn't register, his pin was his pin, and Earth Shatter was a complete mess. Sometimes it wouldn't hit people right in front of him, other times it would stun people who entered the ult's range way after it had actually been used, and on top of that it could hit people high in the air while still not working on stairs. In their first ever change of a hero, Blizzard tried to remedy this in 2017, but it just ended up being an effective nerf without solving a lot of Shatter's issues. This then wouldn't be properly fixed until September of 2018. As you can tell, 2017 was not a great year for Rein, but it wasn't all bad. The base character was still popular and so was played a good amount at low to mid levels, especially thanks to Dive being unrealistic for the majority of the player base. On top of that, Rein did at least have a non-gameplay related win, ending the year strong with the Honor and Glory cinematic. I will admit it is my favourite Overwatch cinematic of all time. Feel free to disagree, but either way it took the necessary steps to further Rein as a character and truly set him up as an icon. Previously, we'd just seen Rein as this glorious warrior who's always excited for the next fight, someone you can look up to, but never really someone you can relate to. This cinematic gave him some depth, and thereby allowed the audience to connect with him on a deeper level, even if you aren't a German crusader fighting huge robots. Even though the year leading up to this hadn't been the greatest for Rein, it set things up perfectly for the following year to potentially be a smash hit. And 2018 would be the year Reinhardt solidified his spot as the iconic Overwatch tank. Now, after the cinematic's release, he would still have to wait a little longer. In terms of ranked, he was already creeping his way back into viability, but at the absolute top, aka in the inaugural season of the Overwatch League, Dive was still dominant. Reinhardt saw very little play in this first season, getting dwarfed by Winston as the preferred main tank. But let's not dwell on this too much, because it's about time for a comeback story. Remember how Rein received no changes despite being meta for the first year of Overwatch? Well, apart from a slight buff mid-year, which was largely just made due to a prior bug, Rein also received no significant adjustments in 2017. So despite not doing great, Blizzard still thought he was fine, and when the meta finally began to shift away from Dive, he was back in business. 20th of March 2018 was the day that marked this change with the release of Brig. Dive had been so much of a problem that she was designed specifically to counter it, and so once she came out, the door was reopened for Rein to make his grand return to the top. In the Overwatch League, the effect wasn't immediate, but he still saw a respectable pick rate at the end of the season. And in ranked, things changed even more quickly. As soon as Brig became playable and competitive, the legendary duo of Rein and Zarya shot back to the top, along with Double Sniper. And by June, he had once again become the most played hero in the entire game. But Rein's return to dominance didn't stop there. The Double Sniper meta he frontlined remained popular until September, and even after that he stayed first choice. Eventually, people would come to realize the true potential of Brig and developed the infamous GOAT comp, a comp which included Rein and kept him in the meta once again. Even though he may not have been quite as defining for the comp as some other heroes, he was still used in it a majority of the time. Thanks to the immense power of GOATs, this resulted in Rein continuing to be meta in top 500 for another 8 full months. And once the Overwatch League came back around for Season 2 in 2019, he was used in more than half of all teams for the majority of the season. As such, some incredible Rein players were able to make a name for themselves, most popularly Super. On top of that, Reinhardt was obviously also popular in regular games, and stayed in the top 2 most played tanks between Bronze and Diamond for all of 2019. Even though metas generally don't affect regular players too much, he was already popular beforehand, and so GOAT only went to aid him further. And at this point, I'd say he had cemented himself as the iconic Overwatch tank. However, things at this time weren't all sunshine and rainbows. Rein may have been the most popular tank in the game, but pick rate isn't everything. Despite not being the primary issue of GOAT, his consistent necessity was bound to stir up some complaints. Any hero will get complained about if dominant for too long, and although most people generally enjoy brawly Rein metas, he was no exception to this rule. On top of that, Rein actually didn't feel that great to play during GOAT. Not that he was bad, far from it, but as we know, being bad and feeling bad are two separate things. The problem was that over time there had simply come far too much crowd control into the game, and since Rein stood at the front, he got hit by a lot of CC. Lucio Boob, Anna Sleep, the enemy Rein's Shatter, and of course Brig's Shield Bash, just to name a few. Originally, this patch went through shields and had priority over charge, so although this would eventually get changed, before then it was rough. Brig could genuinely just walk up to you, stun you through your shield, thereby making you drop it and letting your entire team get shattered. Furthermore, unlike today, Reinhardt had no crowd control reduction as a passive or anything, so he could genuinely get sent all over the place. As you can tell, this was not ideal, but neither was GOAT, and so Blizzard finally did something about it in August of 2019. This day marked a big moment for Ryan. Not only was Rollock introduced, but he also got new competition from Sigma as a shield tank, as well as gaining the Steadfast passive which reduced the effects of crowd control on him. Ryan would finally get knocked around a little bit less. The introduction of Sigma and Rollock would be the bigger talking points however, as they immediately killed GOAT, with Sigma instead taking the reins to create double shield. Although Ryan also technically fills the criteria of this meta, Sigma was instead paired with Orisa since she actually had range and didn't have to stop everything in order to hold shield. As a result, Ryan was finally pushed back out of the meta for a while. At first, he became completely irrelevant in higher level play before eventually returning to a healthier point a few months later by the end of the year. He was surprisingly enough even dethroned by Sigma and Orisa in Bronze and Diamond for the month of September, but as previously he held his high pick rate in low to mid ranks on the whole, and thanks to Steadfast he ended up in a pretty decent spot. Due to Double Shield's power, Blizzard decided to nerf barriers as a whole in December, and so Ryan was caught in that as well. This wasn't all bad though, as he got even more knockback resistance and moved faster whilst holding shield, and so actually became semi-meta by the start of 2020. Sigma and Orisa were still better at the absolute top, but other than that, Ryan saw a lot of play. So much so that he went on to receive his first ever proper nerfs in April, 4 years after the game's launch. In terms of the Overwatch League's third season, he was actually pretty meta prior to these nerfs, but then fell off a bit afterwards. Yet in terms of regular games, it of course had barely any effect. Ryan players did become frustrated by the nerfs' shatter as the stun time fell too short after the nerf, but Blizzard kept it at 2.5 seconds for the rest of Overwatch 1. Other than that, though, most people seem to think he was balanced and generally fine, except of course charge still being terribly inconsistent. And that's pretty much all you need to know about 2020 until December when Ryan suddenly got a huge buff. Although strong at the start of the year, he had fallen off a little towards the latter half, and so Blizzard eventually decided he needed a little more juice to keep up, but this much may have been a bit extreme. Now, the effect wasn't immediate, but after a few months, Ryan had managed to once again become the most picked tank in the game. Honestly, with those changes, I'm not surprised. When it comes to the Overwatch League, he became quite meta for a while in 2021, although mostly in North America. He would later get half of his buff reverted though, and then settled back into a better spot overall. Additionally, he would get his shatter impact damage at the start of 2022. So, at this point, Ryan was obviously the iconic Overwatch tank. Not only did he have the design to back it up, but he had also been the most played tank throughout most ranks for most of Overwatch 1, whilst also having plenty of time in the top meta. Despite being played so much, on the whole he remained well liked by the community, being popular to play but not too annoying to verse, and nice to have on your team the majority of the time. But what about Overwatch 2? Ryan has retained his spot as the most iconic tank and is still mostly well liked, but we all know that Overwatch's sequel hasn't actually been too kind to Reinhardt. So what happened? To summarize things in one phrase, 5v5 happened. Now, I don't say this to clown on 5v5, but this rule set change undeniably hit Ryan particularly hard. He was the tank in Overwatch who relied the absolute most on his off-tank to protect both him and his backline. So when he was suddenly alone, things didn't look great. As with most tanks, Ryan did get some changes to attempt to remedy this shift, such as more health, a better charge, and 2 fire strikes, although his shield was nerfed. But these changes just adjusted his individual power. They really didn't do anything about his sudden lack of support. Not only would Ryan now be alone at the front to eat every single ability thrown his way, but he would also be forced to just let his team die to flankers unless you turn around and give up all the space you just took. Of course, 5v5 affected every tank, but as you can see, Ryan was severely crippled by this change. So, how was Ryan fared during Overwatch 2 in 5v5? Well, thanks to the huge boost to his health pool, he was very tanky during the game's beta, and so was nerfed going into the official launch. However, in the 2022 Overwatch League, which used the beta stats, he was barely played at all, and even then almost half his playtime came from a single person. As a result, he wasn't spectacular on release. Sure, he was still solidly tanky, but he couldn't accomplish much else. Despite already being team reliant, it became even more crucial to play him with the perfect support lineup, because if you didn't get enough speed or healing, you were finished. On top of that, Reinhardt is one of the heroes most negatively affected by counter swapping. Not only was it enough for him to lose his off tank, but 5v5 also meant that Reinhardt had to deal with constantly being counter swapped on, especially by the newly reworked Orisa. And so he wasn't great, but due to aforementioned reasons, he was of course still very popular among most players in terms of pick rate. Yet, this was not the end of Reinhardt's Overwatch 2 suffering. Once the game's second season rolled around a couple of months later, a new challenger had entered the arena, and this time it was a genuine competitor, Reinhardt. Not only did he have a shield, but he was also a close-range brawl tank who filled a very similar role to Reinhardt, albeit with slightly more range. And although he was weak on release, less than 2 weeks later he suddenly got buffed up to crazy levels. On top of that, heroes such as Orisa became even stronger, and so Reinhardt got completely pushed out of any competitive relevancy. After this, Reinhardt has gone through a few buffs and nerfs, getting thrown in and out of the meta as a result, yet never reaching the highs original Reinhardt had at the absolute top level. Season 3 was probably his highest point, where he was great in most ranks and good in top 500, but after that he began to fall back off, and has to my knowledge never since been dominant in higher ranks. The release of Mauga in particular did not help this, as although he doesn't necessarily counter Ryan, he was OP on launch, and playing Ryan into Mauga is not a fun time. In terms of Owl's last season, although Mauga wasn't out yet, Ryan was still basically non-existent outside of Hardy, due to not only Dud being mostly meta, but Ram also being the better rush tank. And once 2024 later rolled around, he was still in a rough spot, but has thankfully received some buffs since then which make him playable. All of that aside though, the real problem that Ryan has nowadays is simply how he feels to play. Sure, GOAT's Ryan maybe wasn't super fun either, and all tanks in Overwatch 2 are suffering right now to some extent, but Ryan is just not in a great place in 5v5. There's a reason why people have become sick of hearing Ryan players complain, because the reality is that he just feels bad now, whether or not he is strong. This doesn't take away from him being the iconic Overwatch tank or anything, but I just wanted to add this in because it is the sad reality the hero faces today. I mean, he still has the highest tank pick rate and a great win rate, he's still iconic, he's still well liked by the community as a whole, but he is not the Ryan of old. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed, why not check out Widow's history next? After all, she is an original 21 hero. Or you could watch this other hero history. Either way, I'll see you next time.